Welcome everybody. How are you today? I love seeing all the cool costumes everybody's wearing. Very, very cool. We're not a costume panel necessarily. We are a panel that's going to talk about this book. It's called When Women Wrote Hollywood. It is a collection of chapters on famous female screenwriters who were famous, ran their own production studios, directed their own films. They were the women who wrote Hollywood. But as Hollywood became a city that involved studios, which had male administrators, suddenly they started to hire less and less women, and those histories faded away. One of the hard things is that we run history by what paperwork you leave behind. So as much as I adore the internet and email, you better print some shit out and give it to a library. Or do something. Because women whose history disappeared, many of the women died young, and the men who worked with them got interviewed by the Motion Picture Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, and the older gentlemen were more than happy to tell you that they did most of the work on their films. And that woman whose name on it, she tried, but he kind of fixed the stuff she didn't do right. And that's how they went down in history. So this is a panel of women who all had their MFAs in television and screenwriting, and they all contributed to the book. They've each studied a particular female screenwriter, and they're each going to give you about 3 minutes on that person, why they're so cool, why we should know their names, what films you can find often on YouTube, some of the older ones, other ones you can find at libraries, or they'll travel around the classic film channels. So we'll hear from each of them for about 3 minutes, and then we'll do some questions. And then we'll just see where everybody's at with that. So if anyone's interested, we have books, because doesn't everyone have books for sale afterwards? Is everybody ready? All right, I am Dr. Roseanne Welch. I teach the history of screenwriting at Stephens College MFA in TV and Screenwriting. I teach the history of screenwriting because if you teach the history of film, you're teaching the history of directors, which is generally the history of men. So we went back to screenwriting and we thought about these women. We found in the silent era, more women were writing in film, and they made more money than even the men who wrote in film. And they eventually, as I say, faded away. So each person has studied someone, and they're going to tell you about them. We're going to begin with a woman you'll hear about named Eleanor Glynn, and she invented something that you'll hear about even today, even though you don't know her name. And the person who will speak to us about her is Amy Banks. She's a professor from Missouri of creative writing, and that's Amy Banks on the end. So we will hear about Eleanor Glynn.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Kind of? Yeah? Okay. I'll be loud. So Eleanor Glynn was responsible basically for creating the career of It Girl, Clara Bow. She coined the term it, denoting sex appeal, that certain something, that je ne sais quoi, certain actors and actresses. Rudolph Valentino, has anyone heard of him? Or Clara Bow obviously was very famous. And it was really her who got their careers going. The cool thing that I like about Eleanor Glynn, if you're like me or getting a little bit older and you're like, can I do this, can I do this? She didn't come to Hollywood until she was 56 years old. So that's when she started her career. She only worked in Hollywood for about 10 years, but 27 films were made from her writings, from her books, from her screenplays. She was a novelist first. That's how she made her money. She, let's see, her initial contract was with Jesse Lasky. It was for $36,364 annually and enough time off for a yearly trip to Europe. So that was her first big success was with the film The Great Moment in 1921. Kind of cemented her position as a writer in Hollywood. She was very eccentric. She was known to have these parties, these salons where people would lie on tiger skins, and she was a big talker. She always had cats. Her favorite, I have a picture here of her, you can't see it, but her 2 cats, Voltaire and Candide. She was just a really fabulous woman. Let's see. Yeah, she was from the UK. She was from Brighton. I'm sorry. She also worked a lot as a consultant in Hollywood. Besides being a writer, she was like an image consultant, and it was like with Rudolph Valentino, for example. He, when he was first starting out, he was kind of effeminate, and she was the one who sort of molded him into the charismatic sex star that he was. The same thing with Clara Bow. She had this way of like adopting people, writing scripts for them, and making their career explode by giving them that charisma and teaching them how to dress and act and be. She was very proper, very British, and very sophisticated. She had a horrible marriage, sort of famous for having decadent affairs with very young men, and wrote a lot about it. 3 Weeks was her big novel that was made into a huge movie, and it's very scandalous about this older woman having this scandalous affair with a young man, and what happens within the period of 3 weeks over the course of their affair. So she was just a really cool person. Like, I'm talking too much, I'm sorry, but she's really cool, and seriously, like, just Google her sometimes and like look at pictures of her, because she was so fabulous. And I think the big takeaway from her is it's never too old to follow your dreams. Do whatever you want. Anybody can make it. You know, you just gotta try.
Oh, excellent! Yeah, thank you. Yes, if you think about the concept of it and the concept of branding women like that, you can go all the way through Hollywood history, from Clara Bow to Marilyn Monroe to Lady Gaga. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Whatever that undescribable quality is that makes people love them. So yeah, all right. So our second kind of crazy lady from the early days in Hollywood, her name was Fredericka Sager-Maas. She had an up and down career. And we're going to hear about her from Michaela Daniels, who is the host of a classic television program in Spokane, Washington. Michaela.
So first let me get close to that. So first I want to point out, like, I got my undergraduate degree in film, and for 2 years I studied film history, and I literally did not learn about a single woman. So that's a problem, which is kind of why we're writing these books, because if there aren't the books out there, the teachers aren't going to teach them, right? So Fredericka she was a little crazy. She always wanted to be in film. She was the youngest of 4 children, and from an early age, her dad used to take her to the Nickelodeon movies, and she used to sit on his shoulders so that she could watch them. So she always knew she wanted to be in film. And so she was born in 1900, which seems very, very long time ago. But she had a really hard time with things. She did start off being hired to write, and unfortunately, she lost a lot of her credits. So there was a big thing about how to get credits with the WGA, and a lot of women like Fredericka, they're not credited for these films, right? And as a writer, your only proof of what you've done is your credits. It's your, for us now, it's IMDb, right? So she's lost all those credits in history. They're not attributed to her. I could not even find the amount of films that she had written, because so many of those things have been lost. The major film that she wrote was called The Shocking Miss Pilgrim, and she had a nightmare deal over it, ended up not liking how it ended out with the script and everything, and she just had a really hard time. She ended up marrying another writer, Ernest, and they kind of, they worked together, they worked opposite each other, they didn't always work together, but they had a really good supportive marriage. Unfortunately, there was the blackballing of the communists, right? So there was the whole big thing in Hollywood where oh, if you're a communist, you're going to get blackballed, and it was ridiculous, right? They were taking directors and writers, and they were just completely blackballing them. Well, Fredericka and her husband, they were kind of mouthy, right? So they used to say things when they thought things weren't right, and that did not help her. So guess who got blackballed during that time? Oh, she did. It got so bad that her and her husband, they got in their car, they drove up to the Hollywood Hills, and they were going to commit suicide. They didn't, thank God. They decided not to, and they kind of came back. She never really worked much after the early years of Hollywood, but she wrote an amazing tell-all book. If you want to know about how horrible and drug-induced Hollywood was, and the sex parties, you want to pick up her memoir, which was called The Shocking Miss Pilgrim. It details all the old Hollywood stars, all the crazy things that were going on. And she ended up publishing that book in 1999, right? And how she got away with publishing that book is everybody else in the book was dead. So, Fredericka got the best revenge of all of them, and that's why I kind of titled my chapter, The Best Revenge is Outliving Them All, because Fredericka outlived everybody who screwed her over. She lived to 111. She only died in the 2000s, so she didn't die that long ago, and for a woman who was born in 1900, right? So I think the biggest thing, my takeaway from that is no matter who's trying to, ruin your career or whatever they're going to do for you, all you got to do is outlive them. And then you can just write a whole book and it'll be great. So.
Oh, yeah. Yes, that's a crazy book. I read that years ago when I was a kid in Cleveland at the library, because there were few books by women who had been in that Hollywood in that period, and I was still probably too young to read that book. All right. Next, we're going to move into sort of the 30s, 40s-ish era. Women were losing their positions, but some of them stayed involved in different ways, depending on who they were connected to. And a woman of particular quality who had had great success in her earlier career and continued into that success because of these relationships was named Bess Meredith. And we're going to hear about her from Sydney Haven, who this very weekend you owe for all the work that's being done here to make the Denver Popular Culture Con happen. So this is Sydney.
So I wrote about Bess Meredith. She did not write anything down ever. So if you're going to be in the arts, or really anything, write an autobiography or a memoir or something, even if it's never published, even if nobody ever reads it, write it down. Because all the information that I got about Bess was from the autobiography of her son, John Meredith Lucas, who is also a writer in Hollywood. But he even said in his book that he never took the time to talk to her and listen to her and write down her stories, and everything that he knows about her is just, stories that she told, but are they true, are they not true? He has no idea. So, I wrote this essay about her, and a lot of the information came from his autobiography. It's called 80 Odd Years in Hollywood, and it could all just be completely untrue. Like, I have no idea because she never wrote anything down. But she was a really cool lady. Even after she stopped working in Hollywood, which happened way earlier than it should have, and I'll get into that a little bit, she just never lost her sense of humor. She was always laughing and always making jokes and always, she was trying to fit into the man's world, and at the time that was adapting your behavior and the way that you spoke and portrayed yourself as more like the men. And she was very accepted. She was able to get a lot of her work because of that. She worked with a lot of very well-known actors. One of them was John Barrymore, who's known as the Great Lover. And he hit on her one time, and she was like, "Look, John, I know you're the Great Lover. You don't have to prove anything to me." And he was like, "Oh my God, you're right, cool." And she was like, "All right, wait a minute. You don't have to be that relieved about it." But she was just really funny. She used to play, this is from her son's autobiography, when she was older and she was in a nursing home, she used to play pranks on her nurses. She would scatter her pills all over the floor and then lay on the floor, and her nurses would come in and think that she had died, and then she'd be like, But, so she originally she worked in vaudeville in New York. And her health was not great, and the New York weather was not great for her health, so she moved to LA, the better climate, Southern California. She started working at Biograph with D.W. Griffith. She was one of his extras, stock players is what they were called. And then she realized that she could make more money if she was writing and acting. She wanted to make more money, so she started writing. And she met a man named Wilfred Lucas, who was a director. She married him, and they had their son, John Meredith Lucas. And then later on, after they divorced, she married Michael Curtiz, who directed Casablanca. And he, later on, would come to the meetings, and the writers would be like, "Okay, Michael, what do you want to do today?" And he'd be like, "I don't know, I have to go talk to Bess." And he would go home and he would talk to his wife, and she wasn't working in Hollywood anymore at this point. And he would get ideas from her, and they would talk, and they would break down the script and the scenes from the day, and then he would go back to work and be like, "So here's what I'm thinking." And he would just, deliver all of these ideas as if they were his, and all the writers were like, "You had no idea what we were talking about yesterday. You talked to your wife. We know that these are Bess's ideas." But she never got any credit for it. She was never credited as, a consultant or a writer or anything like that, which is pretty standard. And fun fact, I named one of my cats Bess after Bess Meredith. So now every time I say Bess, I think I'm talking to my cat. So the reason she stopped working in Hollywood was because she worked really closely with a man named Irving Thalberg, who was a really big champion of a lot of the early women writers. but his health was not great either, and he died fairly young. He was in his 30s when he died. And when he died, the whole leadership in the studio changed, and they came in and they sat her down and they said, all right, we know you've been doing this for years and years, but here's what we're going to do. You can either start completely over as a contract writer. What did they call it? It was
Junior writer.
Junior writer. That's what it was. That was the word. So they were like, you can come back in as a junior writer, and this was a woman who had been doing this for decades at this point. And they were like, you can come back in as a junior writer, we'll cut your salary, you're not likely to get credit, you're probably not going to get a lot of work, or you can just quit. And she was like, bye. So she quit, and she never went back to Hollywood, and she suffered with a lot of mental illness. She had anxiety, she had depression, and so after that she was sort of like voluntarily bedridden for the rest of her life. She never really left her house again, she never worked again. And then just real quick, one thing I wanted to share was, this was my favorite part, I included it in my essay. Once her son was working in Hollywood, on his first day of directing a movie, she sent him a telegram, and it says, have you a small part for me? I was a star of the silent films. I also did some writing before the pictures talked and the trains ran on schedule. If interested, please contact me, and perhaps you also have something for my husband, who directed pictures in Hungary. And she signed it, Mrs. Genius Martyr. That was Best Meredith.
There you go. So everybody watched Casablanca. Like, how much did Beth have to do with this movie that we all love and know?
Right.
Cool. All right. Now, speaking of tough ladies, probably one of Hollywood's toughest. At least that was her reputation for a long time, and that probably helped and hindered her in some ways. And likely might be the name you will recognize from this whole group right now because of other famous things in her life. It is Lillian Hillman, and we're going to hear about her from Kelly Zing, who is a singer and songwriter in the area and does a brilliant show about Patsy Cline. So this is Kelly.
Yep.
Well, the reason I chose Lillian Hillman is because she's very complex. I like to write complex characters. I like to see complex characters up on the film. And I think she's the best example of that in this lineup of women. She was born in New Orleans and raised during the flapper era, so maybe some of that had an effect on the way that she wrote, the way that she saw the world. She was always very progressive in terms of the way she saw social issues. She was for civil rights. She sued the US government for the Watergate files. She was just very instrumental in that, in politics and social issues. She was also extremely imaginative. When she was a kid, she followed someone down the street all day long with a friend of hers, thinking that they were spies. It was right after World War I. It ended up being that there was a musician and a school teacher. Know anybody like that in here? Takes an imagination to be a writer, probably. But she was also extremely controversial. She wrote a play called The Children's Hour, which was one of the first things written about a lesbian love triangle. It was about a kid in a school who reported her teachers for having a love affair, two female teachers. And she was actually, people nominated her for a Pulitzer Prize. And the head of the Pulitzer Committee refused to go see the play because of its controversy. But she did end up winning, I think, a New York Critics Award for that play. She was extremely difficult. She was complicated. Somebody once talked to her about, you need to be more nice. She said, I am nice. She's like, and I am modest. And anybody who doesn't think so is a cocksucker. So this was her personality. She wrote letters to Leonard Bernstein. She did write with Leonard Bernstein on Candide. They collaborated together. She wrote him a letter that said, you're too interested in what your attorneys, are saying instead of understanding what I need. She goes, you obviously don't understand our friendship very well. I have a letter, and she is just that blunt. She also wasn't very attractive. I think people thought, somebody said she looked like George Washington. If you start thinking about her in a modern context, I'm sure there's lots of women out in the public eye that you could think of that say that she's not attractive, she's a criminal, think about all of the women who have made strides in our own time. And I think Lillian Hillman mirrors that. She was kind of the first one. But you would think that all of these things would break her. People called her a liar. She was up in front of the House for Un-American Activities Committee They asked her, because she was also a Stalinist, they asked her, to name names, and she said, "I refuse to cut my cloth to suit today's fashions." She was one of the first ones that said, "I will not speak out against my, comrades, the people that I write with, the people that I work with, I love them." You would think that all of these things would break her, and it's not true. She wrote another play called Little Foxes that became a movie, was nominated for 9 Academy Awards. She wrote 3 volumes of her memoir and got awards for that as well. I think the takeaway with Lillian Hellman is, especially as a woman, that you need to write or create what you're going to create and not worry about what you're saying to the world, because you'll probably be controversial anyway, just by the fact that you're a woman. And I think that she was sort of an influencer in that way. You know what I mean? That she created a lot, she was extremely successful, and yet she wasn't well liked by individuals. But the world of literature and film loved her.
Lovely. All right, yes, Lillian Hellman was a fascinating character to read, and there's a woman who wrote her own memoirs, therefore she is someone we can research and someone whose name has stayed alive for us. So we're actually going to wrap the panel out, and I want to speak briefly about a person that I wrote about, with, again, Amy Banks, discussing a woman who didn't write enough down, and we pretty much know about her because of her dog, and her name was Jane Murfins.
Hello again. Jane Murfin is actually on the cover of our book. I found her absolutely fascinating because it was very difficult to find anything out about her. She was another one, plain Jane. She was another one who just didn't write things down. A lot of men took credit from her for her ideas. She started out, she grew up in Michigan, as did I, going to college to be a teacher. And there she met her lifelong best friend, Jane Cowell, and they started writing plays together. Well, they had this idea, when they were 2 women writing plays together, they were getting nowhere. They were getting no traction. So they took the pen name of Alan Langdon Martin. And as Alan Langdon Martin, their first very successful play was called Lilac Time, or Lilac. I'm from Michigan, other people say it differently, but that's my accent. Anyway, the two, Jane married a man in Michigan, Mr. Murfin there. It didn't last long. It lasted less than 2 years. She ditched him, and her and Jane went to Hollywood. So let's see, sorry. In 1920, she married Lawrence Trimble. He was a Vitagraph director. And that's when her career started taking off, going from plays to movies. He gifted her a German police dog, which she named Strongheart. I don't know if anybody, I know you guys are pretty young, right? But up until like the late 1980s into the 1990s, there was Strongheart dog food. If anybody remembers that or hearing about that. Strongheart was the first dog star. Before Rin Tin Tin, before Lassie, he was this big, gorgeous German police dog. They got him in Germany. He was highly trained, and they made him a star. Jane did. When you read about her, though, when you find out, Lawrence Trimble gets all the credit. They say there's even a children's book about Strongheart, and I've written to the author and haven't heard back because they're like, where is Trimble's dog did this? I'm like, no, this was Jane's dog. Jane trained him. She wrote all his movies. She shot all his movies. She directed them. She made this dog a star. Tragically, Strongheart ended up, his career was cut a little bit short. He got burnt on a Klieg light on his leg, and it developed into this horrible malformation, and his career sadly ended. But her career went on. She did all kinds of movies with Hollywood's most famous women writers and directors. In 1939, she and Anita Luce, who is a bigger name in Hollywood, one of the women that we do remember, they wrote the classic movie The Women, which was also produced in 2008, and she still got writing credit for that years after her death, because it was so well written that they kept a lot of the original lines, a lot of the original dialogue, which she wrote. Anita Luce called Murfin one of the most reliable screenwriters in Hollywood. in her 1974 tell-all, Kiss Hollywood Goodbye, which is a wonderful book. She also, in 1940, Jane teamed with the famous British novelist, Aldous Huxley?
Yeah.
And they wrote the screenplay for Pride and Prejudice, which is still the gold bench standard even today. That version of Pride and Prejudice is the most famous one, the most highest grossing, and the one that's considered the classic version of the film. She also, her third husband, when she and Trimble, and that's another thing, like with Trimble, it was so hard to find information about Jane. It was like, in some sources it said they were married, and others it didn't. Some sources say they had a daughter, some say that was her stepdaughter. It was very hard. One of the only sources I could find, just a lot of newspaper articles. I did so much research and digging on her because it was very hard to find information. And then she had like a great nephew who has a website with some information about her, and he was able to clarify things for me and give me a better timeline. But which is another indication that if you're a woman and you're doing this, write your stuff down, because then who knows who's going to tell your story? Nobody's going to tell your story if you don't. But she, her third marriage, she married British-born character actor Donald Crisp. He was he often played the role of like doting codger in films like Lassie Come Home and National Velvet. He was kind of that old crazy man. And then he ended up, he became very ill, and he moved back home to Britain, and she decided to stay on in Hollywood with her best friend Jane Cowell, and they continued to write together. She had a long and prolific career. She wrote many films, and in fact she wrote the first film that Katharine Hepburn starred in. She wrote for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Joan Crawford, Greer Larson, Laurence Olivier. She served on the board of directors for the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences. She became one of the founding members of the Screenwriters Guild. And when it was reformed as the Writers Guild of America in 1933, they asked her to write the original rules and guidelines. So she became RKO's first female supervisor and producer at MGM. And she died 5 years after her lifelong best friend Jane Cowell, and the two are buried side by side in Hollywood. So I think they have a beautiful friendship story. Jane was just an amazing, prolific writer, very funny. She had a very good comedic timing, and made a dog a star. So definitely learn more about her in the book.
Cool. All right, and I'm just going to say a couple words on Ruth Gordon, who some people may have heard of her, right? Okay, some people know her as an actress. But she, in fact, was Academy Award-nominated screenwriter on 4 different films that she co-wrote with her husband, Garson Kanin, who was a Broadway director. He was about 14 years younger than she was. She'd been a Broadway star. She'd been told that she was too ugly to be a performer, but she really wanted to be, so she did it anyway. She was so determined that she was bow-legged when she was born, and she allowed the doctors, when she was a 20-year-old, to break her legs so they could be reformed into the right shape so she could go on Broadway. And then she moved to Hollywood. She was best friends with Thornton Wilder, who's the author of Our Town, which is a wonderful play. And she and her husband wrote Adam's Rib and Pat and Mike, which are 2 very famous Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy movies. And the only thing I really want to say about Ruth is that when you hear about Katharine Hepburn being a feminist, you're wrong. Katharine Hepburn portrayed a feminist in films because she was reading the words written by a real feminist who was Ruth Gordon. Because Katharine Hepburn, as we know, stayed with Spencer Tracy all his life. He never left his wife for her, and sometimes he beat her up. That's not the definition of a feminist in my book. Ruth Gordon got everything she wanted in life and did the job she wanted and won an Academy Award when she was about 72 years old for Rosemary's Baby. So she's a pretty cool lady as well, obviously a chapter book. So these are the ladies. There are 20 different ladies mentioned in this book that all these folks have done research on, and we've had a good time talking about them. If there are any questions, I have some questions to ask the panel, but if you all have any questions about this era in Hollywood, about how women fared, about what happened to them, any of that stuff, let me know. Otherwise, I will ask the question. So shy. All right. One of the things I want to know, I want to think more deeply. Oh, I got questions. Thank you.
So I found myself thinking, you guys have said maybe we need to have women writers write their memoirs a little bit more. Is there anything else that your research collectively has helped you when you're seeing things happen in Hollywood with more women writing TV now and things like this? Are there any lessons you guys have seen in context from your research that are happening now, or insights into changes that have happened?
Confidence is everything, and if you don't feel confident, pretend you're a middle-aged white man and you get shit done. Because they have all the confidence in the world. No offense, any middle-aged white men. But as women, I think we were just talking before the panel about the imposter syndrome, or about how I can't do this, or I'm not as good. No middle-aged white man ever thinks that. So put on those pants.
And that your voice matters.
Yes.
You know, what you say and what you write and what you create, it matters. And if you have confidence in that and you just keep selling you until someone buys it.
Yeah, I think the most established people, you know, I've been working in film for a couple years now, and you just have to keep doing it, right? There's always going to be people who keep on telling you no. And what we've seen with the women is that the women who are doing so much in television stuff right now, they never took no for an answer, right? They kept doing it. You have Ava, who created her own stuff, you know, you have Issa, and these are women who said, okay, if Hollywood's not going to let me in, that's fine. I'm going to write my own shows. I'm going to create my own product. And we live in the internet age, right? So anyone can write a web series. So if you want to write and you want to create and you want to be a filmmaker, start with a web series, right? That's cheap. They can get picked up. They get picked up all the time. Netflix does it, Hulu does it, Amazon does it. So, you know, the most, you know, no matter if you're male or female or whatever, if you want to do it, you just have to keep doing it and stop listening to the no's, because you get 100 no's and then you get one yes, and that yes is the yes that propels you, you know?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. Definitely, if you're being told no over and over and over, and all of us have, you know, plenty of experience of that, you have to do it yourself. You have to persevere, you have to wait for the yes, or make your own yes. You know, be the one that tells you yes, and don't be afraid to speak out. We've been seeing a lot of women lately speaking out about all kinds of things, you know, credit, you know, poor behavior, all of that stuff. Speaking out, even if at first it kind of casts a shadow over you and potentially over your career, like, that's gonna matter someday. So just keep going and speak up and have confidence, like everybody said.
And definitely in the modern era, it isn't as different as we'd like it to be. You know, I mean, I was just telling Michaela a story about, I wrote a song that Katy Perry's people were interested in, and I had a bass player that put a line on that song and immediately started bullying me about getting half of the credit for that song. The song that I wrote, got the melody to, had it arranged. He put a bass line on it and wanted half of the credit for that. I mean, sometimes things go somewhere, sometimes they don't. But you have to have the wherewithal today even to say, no, my words, my music, you know what I mean? You have to, you put a baseline. It's worth something, but it's not worth that.
Exactly. No, that's very true. In fact, in speaking of the concept of writing things down, you'll know in the modern day, you've been able to read memoirs by Tina Fey and Amy Poehler. They recognize they have to tell their own story, and they're women who speak out always about what they really think and who deserves credit and all these things. My favorite Tina Fey story is, and she tells in her book, when Amy Poehler joined the SNL, she told a joke one day around the table, and Tina thought, oh, this is so funny, and started to laugh, and one of the gentlemen, whose name I forget, was like, that's not funny, don't do that anymore. And Tina thought, oh no, look at how fire her, she's the coolest chick, and I don't want her to go. And while she was all like diving into herself, trying to figure out how she would survive this, Amy Poehler went, basically, F you, I'm here to write the stuff they hired me to write, and this is what's funny to me, so shut up. And Tina had never heard a woman told a guy to shut up again. So she was so fast. And here's Tina Fey, who you already thought was in charge, but even she knew it was still very curriculous. And so, yeah. So you have to write your own stuff, and you have to open your mouth.
Well, I think it's important to find your group of allies, find your tribe of weirdos, and stick with them. If you think about what we're talking about with women in early Hollywood, even they, Jane Murfin and Jane Powell, but Anita Luce, they all picked each other up, they all supported each other. It was all about sisterhood and getting each other's voices out there. It's not a competition, it's for everyone. There's enough success for everyone to go around. So I think keeping that in mind too, we all have our own unique voices. And if you're interested in doing this, it is a long, hard road, but it's absolutely worth it. And find your tribe, stick to them.
I like that. Cool. Other questions? Other thoughts? Yes? Okay.
Out of all the women in Hollywood, in different time periods, was there anything in particular that drew you to each person that you studied?
Oh, good question. Thank you.
I think that the first round actually is when we were all assigned writers. But no, when I was looking for writers to study, I would look for their body of work mostly. You know, I would do just a basic Google search, like, well, what did she write? And if it was like a style, a genre, a particular film that I really liked, she had kind of a background. Like I said, I think Bess Meredith, there was nothing really known about her originally, so it was really hard, like even just doing a basic Google search, like once I had her name, I was like, okay, but there's nothing about her anywhere until I found, you know, her son's autobiography, and just like her sense of humor and just her ability to adapt to situations. You know, everybody always says, you gotta be yourself, and that's true, it is, but you also have to be able to read the room. You know, if everybody in the room is behaving in this one way, you sort of lean more in that direction just to sort of, you know, adapt yourself to those people. And it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you're still being true to yourself at the core. And I think that's what Bess was. Like, that's just who she was. She had that kind of raunchy sense of humor that a lot of the guys had. She was confident. She was never afraid to be like, no, I don't think that's right. I think we should do it like this. And she was always willing to step up and do things and take control and take the lead. And I was really admired that about her.
Yeah, for me, when I do research, I kind of look out for the troublemakers, because I'm kind of a troublemaker myself. And so I love finding these women and these men writers too, you know, the people who are making people uncomfortable, right? So like my whole thing, I tend to write horror genre. I like making people uncomfortable, because when you make people uncomfortable, it's probably because they're having to reassess their values, right? Reassess their knowledge. And so every time I find one of these women like Fredericka, or when I do my hosting for KSPS, you know, I really try to focus on these people who were these outcasts who, you know, were saying things that at the time were really pissing everybody else off. But then you can look back, you know, now we're so far away from it, it's like those are the people who made changes, right? It was the people who were standing up, who were kind of on the outside, the troublemakers, and I'm always sort of attracted to the troublemakers because, you know, I kind of feel an affinity with the, you know, like let's shake things up and make people uncomfortable.
I immediately felt like, I've heard about Lillian Hellman, you know, my whole life. She kind of put the hell in Hellman, you know what I mean? Like, people talked about her in sort of a negative way, as well as a positive way. I grew up with very feminist women in my family. But I felt like, I'm a sucker for an underdog. I'm a sucker for somebody who is being demonized when they're not really truly known. And so I really wanted to know who this woman was that they were saying. I mean, there's articles out there that call her the Soviet trollop. And, you know, just awful things about her. And, you know, she had a defamation suit that went till, I mean, she died before it could be settled, because someone said she lies about everything, including and the. And while I don't think she was ever, you know, I don't think she outright lied maliciously, I think she had an imagination. I think she heard someone say a story once and told the story better. But I don't think she was a liar. I think she was demonized. I think that I'm attracted to, like I said, complex people, and I'm attracted to finding out who someone really is in a more objective way. And her body of work, I think, more than defends her.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love doing research. I love going down those rabbit holes. And so for me, Jane Murfin was just absolutely fascinating because there was hardly anything out there about her. And so it was piecing together all these pieces and just realizing that so much of her work, the credit had been given to her husbands. Lawrence Trimble, for example, just basically they co-wrote everything, but she did the majority of the writing, and he just got all the credit for it. And that she made this huge, you know, strong heart, this huge dog star, and he got the credit for it. It's terrible. She made so many bold moves. She made so many important movies, and just was sort of burned by that. And I think too, she's a Michigan girl, so am I, so it was kind of the homegirl thing. I love that. Eleanor Glynn was just fascinating to me too. Coming to Hollywood at such an advanced age, I mean, it's, 56 isn't that old, but by standards back then.
In Hollywood it is, still.
Yeah, it is, and she just took charge of her own life. I mean, like I said, she had a terrible marriage, and she had kids to raise, and she's like, how am I going to support them? She got divorced, she had no money, she started out as a novelist, wrote a novel a year to support her kids, and then when Hollywood was interested, went and made those movies. So she's just really inspirational to me. It's like you're never too old to live your dreams.